He had been chained to that wall long enough to memorize the drip patterns in the ceiling above him, 3 separate cracks in the stone, each one leaking at its own rhythm. He had cataloged them during the first week, when his mind still needed something to hold on to besides the pain, and by the second month they had sunk below the level of awareness entirely. He stopped noticing them the same way he stopped noticing the cold floor, the smell of the torches, the specific weight of the iron at his wrists. Some things you adjusted to because the alternative was losing your mind, and Ryune had decided very early in his captivity that he was not going to lose his mind. What he could not stop hearing, no matter how far down he pushed it, were the latches on Sans Parton's case. 2 of them, flat brass, set close together. Sans clicked them open each morning with 2 fingers in a precise, practiced motion, and the sound they made was specific enough that Ryune's body had learned to anticipate it the way it anticipated the sessions themselves, a full-body tensing that started before he consciously registered hearing anything. He had tried to condition that response out of himself. He never quite managed it. Sans was tall, well-presented, and carried himself with the relaxed certainty of a man who believed time was working for him. He spoke to Ryune during the sessions the way a craftsman might discuss his work with a difficult material. Observations about the Darren court, thoughts on the Parton family's political position, comments on the curious waste of a noble bloodline that couldn't produce a single mana channel. He was not theatrical about what he did. That was the part that stayed with Ryune longest. The absence of theater. The complete ordinariness of it. He had been at it for months. He had extracted nothing, because Ryune was 14 and powerless and knew nothing of real strategic value. Sans understood this on some level. He continued anyway, with the patience of someone who believes the yield will eventually justify the process. Then one night the dungeon door came off its hinges. Alejandro had been fighting for days before he got here. His chest armor was cracked through and held together only by the strap beneath it. His left arm hung at the wrong angle from the shoulder, and a wound above his ear had sealed badly on its own, with the blood dried and matted into his beard. He crossed the dungeon floor in long strides, dropped to his knees in front of Ryune's chains, and started pulling at the locks. His hands shook badly. He had to stop and restart twice before the first catch opened. He told Ryune he was sorry for the time it had taken. He said House Sermon was still standing, that he had never stopped searching, that he was not going to stop. His voice was steady despite everything his body was clearly working against. Ryune tried to say his name. He couldn't get enough air behind it. The arrows came through the narrow ceiling slits. Someone outside had repositioned, fast and professional. 3 shafts hit Alejandro in the back. He turned his body to keep himself between the slits and Ryune and kept both hands on the second lock, and the lock gave, and then Alejandro sank to the floor with one arm still extended toward the 3rd chain. He caught himself on that arm. He didn't fall completely. His head dropped, his breathing was loud in the quiet, and after a moment he said, very quietly, that he was sorry he hadn't been faster. The 3rd chain was still locked. Ryune was still there. He screamed until the sound stopped coming out of him, and then he kept trying anyway, and then the darkness came from every direction at once. He woke up in his own bed. The ceiling above him was yellow. His mother had insisted on that color when he was very small, had stood on a stepladder, and applied it herself over the servants' objections, and it had stayed that way through every redecoration since. The morning light came through the curtains at a low angle and threw a long stripe of gold across the left wall. He knew this room. He had not been inside it for over a century. He raised his hands and looked at them, small, both wrists unmarked. No chain scarring, no healing skin pressed hard against old wounds, nothing. He sat very still and let the understanding arrive at its own pace. It came not as shock but as a vast settling quiet, the way large news sometimes lands when part of you already knew. He had regressed. The final duel in the dimension of Adon, the last battle of a war that had cost him more than he had good words for, had sent him back. Back past the dimension, back past all the decades, back to this room, this morning, this body, the last moment before House Sermon began its collapse. His body was 14 years old. The curse of Arkan was in full effect, the birthmark placed by Demon Lord Arkan that expelled mana the instant it entered his body, making him functionally inert in a world that measured every heir by their power level. No mana meant no magic. No magic meant no path. The nobles of Darren and Painstroy had a word they applied to him with comfortable consistency. The trash of House Sermon, the broken branch, the one that didn't count. He pressed his palms flat against his thighs. Then he pulled the bell for his maid and asked for a sword. Colin appeared at the door within 2 minutes, still pinning her hair, slightly breathless. She had served him since he was 9, and she had the particular loyalty of someone who had decided a cause was worth believing in regardless of what the odds said. She heard his request and asked him to repeat it. He said, "A real sword from the armory, and something from the containment room. A goblin, alive. A small one would do." She looked at him. 3 full seconds, no expression she was willing to show him. Then she went to do it. The servants gathered in the corridor without any formal summons. Word moved through a household on edge faster than any official message, and within the hour there were perhaps 15 people positioned near his door, with varying degrees of pretense about why they were there. Sena, the 7th-rank archmage who led the household's magic division, had come from a meeting she'd apparently interrupted without explanation. She stood near the back of the group with her arms folded, and the controlled attention of someone being careful not to reveal how closely they were watching. She had given Ryune theory lessons throughout his childhood, with the patient professionalism of someone who had privately accepted that the lessons would never be applied. She was the only person in the corridor paying close enough attention to notice that something about the young lord's posture was different from any version of it she'd observed before. The goblin arrived in a barred cage carried by 2 stable hands who would have strongly preferred a different assignment. It was smaller than Ryune had expected, barely reaching his ribs when it stood upright, but goblins were deceptive. They were fast, low to the ground, and their claws caused festering wounds in unprotected skin. A grown fighter with basic mana reinforcement handled them without trouble. A cursed 14-year-old with no combat conditioning had no rational business in the same room. Ryune told them to open the cage. The silence that followed was long. People looked at each other. Someone near the end of the corridor offered a quiet objection. He said it again, and this time the tone behind it, unhurried, completely certain, the voice of someone who had issued a very large number of orders over a very long career, moved through the room and got the cage door opened. The goblin came out immediately. Ryune had been handed a wooden practice sword, and he let it drop the moment the weight of it landed in his palm. Too light, wrong feedback, the kind of incorrect sensation that would set his rebuilt reflexes back if he trained against it. He took the real sword from the table beside him with both hands, found his footing on the bedroom rug, and waited. He was afraid. He registered it plainly and didn't try to suppress it. His body was 14 with none of the conditioning he'd spent over a century accumulating, and his heart was running fast and his hands were damp on the hilt. And when the goblin covered the distance between them in under a second, something old and animal in him wanted very badly to step back and drop the blade. He moved into it instead. The cut connected badly, too wide, no real form, his grip slipping on the recovery and his shoulder rolling wrong. But it landed, and the goblin went down, and a cold notification appeared in his vision, visible only to him, from a system he'd never once been able to access in his first life. First layer of Arkan's curse, broken. The corridor was completely quiet. Someone near the back dropped something small, and the sound of it hitting the floor was the only sound in the building. Sena's arms had fallen to her sides. Ryune found her face in the group and told her he needed to speak with her privately. They met in his study. She stood across the desk from him with her hands at her sides, in the middle of revising a picture she'd held for 11 years, and doing it without showing how significant the revision was. He had watched her manage her composure in 100 difficult meetings in his past life. She was very good at it. He laid out what he needed. A full mana flood, sustained, maximum output, no interruption until he gave the word. Not a test dose. Everything she had. She told him the feedback would stop his heart. The curse worked by real-time expulsion. A maximum power input would create internal pressure no body without an established mana channel could survive. She had the academic knowledge to explain exactly how the failure would unfold. She explained it. He said he understood the mechanism. He had spent an extended period, he did not specify the nature or length of it, studying magical theory in a context where the conventional frameworks here didn't apply. He had developed a compression method, a technique for catching mana inside the window between its entry and the expulsion's full sweep, concentrating it hard enough to force a circuit before the curse could scatter it. The window was very small. He would need her mana in volume because he would fail multiple times before one attempt held. Senna considered this for several seconds. Then she asked a single question. Was he actually certain, or was he the kind of certain that becomes less so once real pain arrives? He told her he was certain. She came around the desk, positioned herself at arm's reach, and opened her channels at full power. The sensation had no clean comparison. The mana hit, and the curse activated in the first half-second, and the conflict between the two was internal and total, and occupied his entire awareness in the way that severe pain tends to crowd out everything else. He went inward immediately, hunting for the compression window. The gap was there. He had theorized its existence for years in Adon, had built the entire method in his head through long sessions in which he'd had no body to test it in. Finding it in practice was a different matter. The first attempt fell apart before he applied any pressure. The second collapsed faster, like squeezing water. His nose began bleeding during the third attempt. He noted it the way you note rain through glass when you're doing something that requires your full concentration. Fourth attempt, held for 4 seconds. Fifth, held for nearly 8. Senna's power was dropping. He could feel the difference in pressure and volume, the flood becoming a strong current, becoming something more like a steady pour, and her breathing across the room was controlled but audible. She didn't stop. He hadn't told her to. The sixth attempt held. A single circuit, thin as a thread pulled tight, seated in a fold of his body's internal structure, that the expulsion cycle kept moving past without catching. Invisible to any external examination. Technically capable of almost nothing. Not enough to power any real working. But it was real, and it was stable, and it was his. He told her to stop. She released the channel and sat down on the floor, both palms flat on the stone, eyes shut, breathing in the slow and careful rhythm of complete depletion. A 7th-rank archmage, the highest classification of mage on the Drea continent, sitting on a study floor because she had given everything she had to a boy who officially couldn't do magic. She stayed there for a full minute without speaking. When she looked up, he told her he would need her help again in the coming weeks. She said she would tell no one, not even Alejandro. He thanked her. She looked at him the way people look when they realize they've been measuring something against the wrong scale. He let her sit with it and went to find Colin. The household returned to its routines. Ryune managed the story carefully, not suppressing it entirely, because suppression bred speculation, but shaping what it was allowed to mean. A shock response. An adrenaline moment. The follow-up examination had found nerve irritation from the curse's reaction, and the healer recommended rest, and the young lord was resting. That was the story. Senna, who knew the truth, maintained her professional concern with remarkable control. Alejandro received the report without pushing against it. He came by Ryune's room twice in the following days, sitting quietly both times and talking about small things, the state of the southern pastures, a gift from a visiting cousin, and not once pressing for anything Ryune hadn't offered. 4 days after their last conversation, a carved wooden grip trainer appeared on Ryune's desk. No letter, just the object, placed slightly to the left of center. Alejandro had probably started writing something and decided against it. Ryune began using the grip trainer every morning before Colin arrived, by the window, while the house was still waking up. 3 months passed in visible silence. To Truno Hilda's weekly management reports, Truno being the household's general manager, a thorough and organized man who kept every record the estate produced and forwarded summaries through channels Ryune was aware of but had never openly acknowledged, the young lord's status remained unchanged. No training progress. No development, no change in the curse's behavior. Truno documented this faithfully, his reports reaching eyes inside and outside the family, and Ryune read the summaries when he could, and watched Truno's language for any sign of the pressure he knew was coming. He had known Truno in his first life. The man was genuinely devoted to the household. His devotion, though, had a threshold. The kind that holds until something applies enough weight to shift the calculation. Ryune had not decided yet what to do when that threshold arrived. He was watching. After midnight, the real work happened. The system's body modification skills were invisible labor. No visible exertion, no light, nothing to observe. He lay still and worked internally, adjusting muscle fiber ratios, reconstructing the reflex pathways that governed fast movement, building the physical memory that precision combat required. He leveled without any visible sign of it, He allocated stats in complete silence. Each morning he looked exactly as he had the morning before, and each night, the gap between his appearance and what was building underneath widened by another degree. He was thinking, during those nights, about Prince Kyle's upcoming birthday celebration. Every house with standing in Darren's court attended, which meant the Parton family would be present, which meant Sans Parton would be in the same room as Ryune. He remembered attending that party in his first life, remembered the exact section of wall Sans had stood against, the angle of his posture, the particular unhurried smile of a man who had already settled on his next move and was simply waiting to execute it. Sans had been setting up the kidnapping by then. He had months of preparation and a clear target and complete confidence that the target had no capacity to resist. Ryune was going to walk up to him in front of the full assembled court and say something so precisely aimed at a buried point in Sans's history that Sans would be left with exactly two choices: absorb the humiliation publicly, or respond in a way that made his intentions visible. He asked Colin to find documentation on a specific academic disgrace involving Sans Parton from several years ago, an expulsion, something that had been officially suppressed but would still exist in the archival layer beneath the formal record. She came back 2 days later with a thin folder, which she set on his desk with the professional neutrality of someone who has located something potentially dangerous and has decided an opinion on it is above her pay grade. He read it, set it down. Everything he needed was there. The formal invitation to Prince Kyle's celebration arrived in sealed packaging 3 weeks before the event. Ryune accepted it, set it on the desk beside the folder, and sat in his study that night in the quiet of a house asleep, thinking about what the courts of Darren and Painstroy had no idea was sitting inside their world. The trash of House Sermon, the cursed one, the heir nobody counted, a century of surviving a dimension where conventional magic had to be reinvented from first principles. Classes the system here had never produced. A circuit invisible to every scan that existed on this continent, getting stronger every night. A party invitation sitting on a desk next to a file that was going to pull Sans Parton's well-maintained composure apart in front of witnesses. And not a single person who mattered. Not the Parton family, not the court, not the allies already quietly positioning themselves to pick through the wreckage of House Sermon, had any idea. Ryune sealed the acceptance letter. He set it with the outgoing correspondence. He went to bed, and when he closed his eyes, the dungeon didn't come. He slept without it for the first time in this life. That was its own kind of preparation. The road to the capital took 2 days. Ryune spent most of the carriage ride reading, a stack of 3 books on his right and a cup of tea going cold on his left. Colin sat across from him and said very little, which was one of the things he had always valued about her. She had a gift for recognizing when silence was the more useful form of company. Truno Hilda rode up front with the driver. He came back twice to check whether Ryune needed anything, each time departing with the efficient courtesy of a man who had executed this function for years and took quiet pride in it. Ryune thanked him each time. He watched the door close behind him and returned to his book and thought about nothing Truno could have read in his face. Prince Kyle's celebration occupied the central hall of the Darren Palace, a space large enough that the noise of a few hundred gathered nobles created a general hum rather than any identifiable conversation. Tables ran the length of the room. A musician's stage occupied the far end. The ceiling was painted, and candles burned in iron fixtures along the columns, and the whole room had the performed ease of an event that had cost a great deal to arrange and needed to look like it hadn't. Ryune moved through it slowly. He accepted a glass of something cold and did not drink from it. He spoke briefly to the 3 people who addressed him first: a courtier from a neighboring estate who wanted to discuss horses, a minor lord's wife who offered condolences about nothing specific with the practiced warmth of someone who kept a catalog of appropriate expressions for difficult situations, a young knight with more confidence than rank who apparently had opinions about the eastern trade routes. He was patient with all of them. He was also tracking the room. Sans Parton stood near the eastern column, which was where he had stood in Ryune's first life at this exact event. It wasn't sentimental attachment to a position, it was tactical. From that column you had a clean sightline to both the main doors and the secondary exit near the kitchens. You could observe the full social topography of the room without appearing to. Sans was a mage of genuine intelligence and a student of power relationships, and the room arrangement expressed that. He was taller than Ryune remembered. Or perhaps the relative scale was simply different when you were looking at him from the height of an adult rather than from the floor of a dungeon. He wore deep blue with silver trim, which was the formal color of the Parton household, and he held a glass with his ring hand facing out, which was not an accident. The family crest on that ring was a specific piece of social signaling in this court, a small, quiet announcement that the Partons were here and in good standing and not concerned about who noticed. He had a companion on his right, a young woman who was speaking to him with the bright attention of someone who wanted to be remembered. He was listening with half his focus. The other half was on the room. Ryune set down his untouched glass, straightened his collar, and walked over. Sans saw him coming at perhaps 12 steps out. He registered the approach with the faint recalibration of someone who had not expected this particular element, but was not troubled by it. A broken heir from a declining house crossing a room to introduce himself was a minor social event. He arranged his expression into the appropriate greeting. Ryune came to a stop, inclined his head the correct fraction for the difference in age, and said he hoped the evening had been pleasant so far. Sans said it had. He introduced the young woman beside him, who offered a polite expression. Ryune acknowledged her and turned back to Sans. He said he had recently come across some interesting archival material, academic records from about 6 years ago. He mentioned the name of the institution. He mentioned the specific review committee that had handled a certain matter. He said he had found it quite illuminating, especially the section on the methodology employed. The young woman's expression maintained itself from pure social training. The noise of the room continued. Someone laughed somewhere toward the far tables. Sans did not move his ring hand. His face held the courtesy shape it had assumed for the greeting. But something happened at the outer edge of his composure, a tightening, small and fast, that a person watching for it could see, and a person not watching for it could not. He said he wasn't sure what archives Ryune was referring to. He said it pleasantly. Ryune agreed that the records weren't widely circulated. He said he'd had help locating them. He said the specific section on the committee's findings regarding fabricated data had been particularly clear in its language. Institutional language of that kind usually wasn't, in his experience, which had made the directness of their conclusion quite striking. A very short pause. Sans asked, with the measured calm of someone who has decided to treat a provocation as a misunderstanding, whether Ryune was perhaps confusing him with another academic from that period. Ryune said the committee had been quite specific about the name. He said he imagined a formal expulsion on those grounds would be difficult to confuse with anything else. He then excused himself, said he hoped the rest of the celebration was enjoyable, and walked back the way he'd come. He counted his steps and didn't look back. He did not need to look back to know what was happening behind him. Sans would be maintaining the exterior for perhaps another 90 seconds, long enough to let the young woman make her exit with her dignity intact, long enough for the nearest observers to have moved on to something else. His hands would be completely still because he would have put substantial effort into making them so. And then, something behind his face would have gone very quiet and very hard, and a decision would have been taken. Ryune accepted a second glass from a passing servant, and this time drank a small amount of it, and thought, good. The return journey began 2 days later. The carriage left the capital in the early morning, which was the time Truno preferred for departures. Less traffic on the main road, the kind of organizational efficiency that gave him satisfaction. Colin rode inside with Ryune, and Truno handled the outside. The route was the standard one. At the second way station, they stopped briefly for the horses to drink. Ryune sat with his book open, but had not read a full sentence in 40 minutes. He was listening to the sounds around the carriage with the attention of someone who had spent a long time in places where that skill kept you alive. He heard the extra horse before he heard anything else. The carriage rocked when something hit the far wheel. There were voices outside, controlled, professional, not panicked, which was the sign of people executing a plan rather than reacting to one. Colin looked at him. He shook his head slightly and kept his hands visible in his lap. The door opened. There were 6 of them, which was more than necessary for one carriage carrying a boy with no combat ability and a maid. More than necessary meant someone was being careful. That told Ryune something useful about how seriously the Parton house was taking this. Truno appeared at the door behind the last of the men. He didn't meet Ryune's eyes immediately. He looked at a point slightly left of center. He told the men Ryune was the one they wanted. Ryune looked at him steadily. He said Truno's name. Truno looked at him then, and for 3 full seconds said nothing. His jaw moved slightly. Whatever he'd prepared to say had apparently not survived the direct look. He finally told Ryune that he was sorry, that he had no other way to find information on the missing heirs, that the price of this betrayal was information from the Parton side that the family needed, that he had convinced himself it was a calculation that served House Sermon's survival in the end. Ryune said he believed him. He said it without heat. Truno blinked. He hadn't expected that. Ryune said he also believed that Truno had reported his movements and general capabilities to the Parton family over the course of several months, that the information in those reports was specifically calibrated to present him as maximally vulnerable, and that Truno had been constructing an exit story, one where the young heir's disappearance looked like the natural consequence of a weak boy making poor decisions. He said all of this quietly and without accusation. He said, "Is that also accurate?" Truno's face went through several transitions and stopped on something that wasn't quite any of them. He said, "Mostly." Ryune told him that was fine. He told him what he wanted in exchange for this information he'd provided the Partons. Everything. Every contact, every communication, every piece of intelligence Truno had received or was promised. Every name. He said Truno would give all of that to Senna, who would be the one to verify it, and that if it was complete and accurate, Truno would live and would work directly for Ryune going forward, in a capacity that would feel, from the outside, exactly like the loyalty it was replacing. He told the men he was ready to go. They gave him something in a cloth pressed to his face, and he went under fast and came up slowly in a room he recognized. Stone walls, specific dimensions, the smell of the torches, a blend of pine resin and something sulfurous underneath, the unique result of the particular stone this dungeon was cut from. He had memorized this room in the way that things memorized themselves when they were also doing permanent damage to the person experiencing them. His wrists were in irons above his head, attached to a length of chain dropped from a ceiling ring. His feet reached the floor with his heels slightly raised. The chains were good quality, not decorative restraint material, the real thing, with proper weight and no play in the links. The door opened and Sans Parton came in. He had changed from the celebration clothes into something practical. Plain dark fabric, good boots, nothing that would show damage badly. He had a leather case under one arm with two flat brass latches. He set it on the workbench along the right wall and clicked the latches open with 2 fingers in a motion so ingrained it had no deliberate quality left in it. He turned to look at Ryune. His expression was the one Ryune remembered from 100 separate visits to this room. Professional attention, the settled readiness of someone beginning a familiar kind of work. He said the evening at the capital had been unpleasant. He said he held no personal feelings about the business ahead. He wanted to be clear about that. He said Ryune's family held secrets that the Parton house had specific use for, and that the sessions would continue until those secrets were provided, or until the determination was made that Ryune didn't possess them, at which point a different arrangement would be negotiated. He picked up the first instrument from the case. He had barely opened his mouth to say something further when the room went entirely silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has a physical quality, a weight against the ears. All ambient sound lifted out at once, the torch hiss, the distant structural noises of a large building, all of it erased. Sans noticed it half a second after Ryune had activated the working. He looked up from the instrument. Ryune closed his hands around the chains above his wrists and pulled. The ceiling ring gave. The stone around its mounting had been compromised. Hairline fractures Ryune had introduced with a quiet working during the ride here before the sedative took hold. So small they wouldn't appear on any inspection and would fail under exactly the load now being applied. The ring pulled free of the ceiling with a burst of dust and gravel, and Ryune landed on both feet, and the length of chain came down with him. Sans took 2 steps back and raised his hands for a working. In the silence, Ryune could hear the sound of the monochannel activating, a thin high note at the edge of perception, almost felt rather than heard. He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his left hand over Sans's face and pushed him backward into the workbench and held him there. Sans had 5 inches on him and had trained as a combat mage before the incident the committee had noted. None of that translated to anything useful when the pressure on his face was being applied by someone with over a century of physical conditioning behind the motion. The mana working collapsed. The silence held. Ryune looked down at the instruments arranged on the workbench. He took his time looking at them. He picked up the case, examined the interior organization, specific slots, each holding something that had been selected for a specific purpose, and set it down again on the opposite wall where it would be visible to Sans but out of his reach. He said nothing. Sans's breathing through the pressure of Ryune's palm was controlled, which Ryune noted with something like professional respect. Most people, in that position, allowed panic into their breath. Ryune told him to be still. He spent a moment organizing what he needed from his class skills. The Necromancer tree gave him access to something documented in add-ons archives as a method of creating sustained sensory interference within a living target, not damage in the structural sense, nothing that would interrupt the subject's consciousness or compromise the session's utility, just continuous overload of every pain channel simultaneously with nowhere for the signal to discharge to. The forbidden circles had to be carved. It required direct contact with skin. He had no instrument designed for the purpose, but he had found, after a long time in Adon, that improvisation was almost always possible given sufficient knowledge of the underlying mechanism. He drew the first line on Sans's palm. Sans made a sound. The silence working swallowed it. Ryune continued. He worked slowly and methodically and without any of the theatricality that Sans himself had never used. He filled in each circle as precisely as his current body's fine motor control allowed, which was better than it had any right to be, given the 3 months of quiet reconstruction he'd done in his bedroom, and when the third circle completed its connection to the first, the entire working activated. Sans's composure left him at that point. It left in a way that had nothing to do with will or training. The sensation the circles produced wasn't the kind a person adapted to. Ryune had known it from the receiving end with thorough completeness. He watched Sans with the attention of someone conducting an assessment and felt something very different from satisfaction. Something colder and more settled. A specific kind of quiet that arrived when a very long debt began to be settled. He found a corner of the room away from the workbench, sat down with his back against the stone, and waited. The next 7 days had their own rhythm. He slept in intervals when Sans was not coherent enough to produce useful information, using the time to continue the internal work. Stat allocations, circuit maintenance, a careful early attempt at the ghost class prerequisites that required his soul's relationship to its container to be deliberately loosened by measurable degrees, which felt exactly as strange as it sounded. He ate from a supply he had packed into a subspace storage skill before leaving the capital, which Sans's people had found no evidence of during the search when he arrived, because the entry point was located on the interior surface of his left arm in a place that appeared to be a healed childhood scar. Sans, across the room, spent the 7 days in the condition the circles maintained. On the 3rd day, he began providing information. He talked about the Parton family's contacts in the Darren court, their communication channels with 2 rival houses, the names of the people who had been receiving Truno's reports, and what they had been doing with the information. He talked about the specific strategic plan they had built around House Sermon's vulnerability. He talked for long stretches, sometimes going backward to add detail he'd omitted earlier, the way someone does when the barrier between what they intended to withhold and what they're capable of withholding has completely broken down. Ryune listened. He committed everything to memory with the same method he'd used in Adon for information that needed to stay intact. A mnemonic lattice structure that required no external record and left no physical evidence. He asked questions occasionally when the account became inconsistent or a piece of it contradicted something he'd known from the first timeline. Sans answered them. On the 6th day, Ryune heard the sound above, a muffled exchange between 2 people that carried through the stone, and checked his mental count against the calendar. A Parton archmage was coming. He had known one would. Sans had been expected to deliver results quickly, and the silence from the dungeon had been going on long enough that someone with authority and resources had been dispatched. He needed to move carefully now. An archmage ranked at the upper tiers of this continent's power system, a 6th or 7th rank mage with decades of experience, was not a target he could engage directly, not with the circuit structure he currently had, and not inside a building the Parton family controlled. He had one working window, and it required specific positioning, and it required the archmage to believe for approximately 4 seconds that Sans was in control of the room. He put Sans back in a presentable condition, unlocking the chains that had accumulated over the past few days, making the position look like one a captor might arrange rather than one a prisoner had organized. and then he slipped behind the door and began the preparations. The soul transfer skill was theoretically an advanced ghost class technique. He had been working toward it through the 7 days, pushing the class prerequisites deliberately against the limit of what his current stats supported. The system's skill tree didn't hand ghost advancement to someone who hadn't earned the underlying framework. He had been building that framework one carefully allocated stat point at a time, and he was, as of the 6th morning, exactly at the threshold. He needed 2 things to happen in a specific order: the Archmage to enter the room expecting to find a session in progress, and the distraction to hold for long enough. He activated the first illusion projection. His ghost tree skills could generate a visual construct, a copy of his own body, positioned in the room's corner, tied to a specific behavioral loop. It wouldn't pass close scrutiny, but it would pass a glance from a tired mage crossing a threshold with the confidence of someone arriving where they expected to be arriving. The door opened. The Archmage was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, wearing the red trim of the Parton family's senior magic corps. He swept the room with the instinctive scan of an experienced practitioner, and his eyes found the illusion in the corner, and his working was already forming, a wide-spectrum suppression meant to take the room down cleanly. The suppression hit the illusion. The illusion dispersed. The Archmage registered this immediately. A visual construct meant the boy had skills, which was new information, and he began recalibrating the threat level even as he turned his attention toward the actual contents of the room. Ryune was already inside Sans's body. The soul transfer lasted perhaps 2 seconds of subjective time. He had no frame of reference for the process from inside it. It was less a sensation than an interruption, like a gap in a film reel, and then he was looking at the room from Sans's eye level, and his hands were Sans's hands, and the Archmage was 3 steps away, turning toward the sound of Sans's body moving. He covered the distance in one motion and put the blade, Sans's own belt knife, the one Ryune had taken on the first day and kept, into the Archmage's back at the specific angle that ended things quickly. The Archmage did not have time to fully understand what was happening. His working collapsed mid-form, the red trim on his collar bunching as he went down, and the room was quiet with that specific finality that follows something irreversible. Ryune returned to his own body, which was sitting against the wall where he'd left it, and the system interface opened in front of him like a door thrown wide. The level gain was significant. The class advancement notification followed it, Ghost Class, unlocked, and with it a cascade of new skill slots that opened in his tree and immediately filled with techniques he had theorized but never been able to test. Phase shifting at the physical level, illusion decoy generation with full behavioral parameters, soul manipulation at a range his current circuit structure could actually sustain. He sat with it for a moment, just a moment, then he went to work on the Archmage's remains. The Necromancer tree had a specific use for a body this powerful, and he had been thinking about it for most of the past 7 days. What he built from the Archmage's soul was unlike anything in the Drea continent's documented necromancy. Not a standard undead, not the shuffling, decaying labor of the low-tier working. He used a ghost class technique to bind the soul inside a phantom shell and planted a growth mechanism in the core that would allow the entity to develop independently, accumulate experience, and generate its own fire magic through a circuit structure that mirrored the one he'd built in himself, a living dead girl. Blank at the start, the size of a child, watching him with eyes that held no recognition yet but were already learning. He named her Cornac. He put her in subspace beside the corpse inventory he'd accumulated, arranged Sans's body in the position most consistent with a man who had been overcome by his own prisoner, and wrote a short letter. The letter identified Sans Parton as a criminal kidnapper who had been operating a private dungeon for the purpose of unregistered detainment. It directed readers to the marks on Sans's skin for evidence of the forbidden circles. Committed by a party unknown, the letter said, suggesting Sans had been double-crossed by his own contacts. It was signed with a name no one in this building would recognize. He pressed it into Sans's hand. He walked out through the walls. Ghost phase movement on the exterior stone was effortless, in a way that still surprised him. Not surprising that the skill worked, but surprising that a physical boundary could simply become irrelevant when the framework for treating it as relevant had been suspended. He moved through the dungeon's outer wall and stood in open air and found the sky going pink in the east and let the etherealization drop. He kept walking until the Parton property was far enough behind him. Sans Parton was found 2 days later, suspended from a tree at the edge of the estate grounds with the letter Ryune had written pinned to his collar. The official determination was kidnapping, the motive unclear, the perpetrator unknown. It was logged as a common criminal case. The Parton family absorbed the embarrassment quietly, because the alternative was a public examination of what their senior mage had been doing with an unauthorized dungeon, and that examination would have traveled in directions they couldn't afford. Ryune was already in Painstroy by then, using a different name. The name he chose was Leon, short, forgettable, the kind of name that belonged to no particular region and no particular family, which was precisely the point. He had a new set of papers prepared through a contact Sina had maintained in the outer city for years, a document worker whose services were never advertised and whose existence in the household's ledgers appeared as a quarterly grain payment to a non-existent mill. Painstroy was the larger of the two kingdoms sharing the Fainton territory, and the city that bore the territory's name had grown around a central commercial district that made it practical and crowded and very easy to disappear inside. The Martong Assassin Guild maintained its regional branch here with the public face of a private security consultation firm. The signage was modest. The interior reception desk was staffed by a woman who gave the impression of having evaluated every person who had ever walked through that door and found the majority of them not worth the paperwork. She looked at Leon when he entered and waited. He stated his purpose: registration at the 5th grade, the entry rank for candidates with no prior guild record. He placed his registration fee on the desk in correct denomination without being asked. She looked at the money, then back at him, and her expression completed some internal arithmetic that resulted in a document being produced and a stylus being pushed toward him. He signed it and asked when training began. She told him, tomorrow, early, before the city was up, because the guild did not accommodate people who needed the morning to find themselves. He thanked her and left to find somewhere to sleep. The training program at the 5th grade entry level was designed to compress a fundamental curriculum into 8 weeks, an accelerated intake that guild documentation described as a filtering process but functioned, in practice, as an extended assessment. The instructors were not teaching skills so much as observing whether the candidates already had them: technique refinement, physical conditioning, target assessment, threat categorization, a working knowledge of the guild's operational structure and its protocols. Everything else was built on top of this base layer, and if the base layer wasn't there by the end of the 8 weeks, neither was the candidate. Ryune had been training since he was 12, in a dimension where the average opponent had been a magically enhanced entity, capable of ending him in 2 moves on a bad day. The 5th grade curriculum was not demanding in the sense of introducing him to anything new. It was demanding in the sense that he had to be careful about how much he revealed, while revealing enough to pass. He calibrated each session to perform at the upper margin of what an unusually gifted recruit might plausibly achieve, and spent the evenings in his quarters managing the harder constraint, not demonstrating anything that would attract the kind of attention he wasn't ready for. His instructor was a man named Dunn, a senior guild assassin who had the permanently unhurried manner of someone who had decided a long time ago that composure was more useful than urgency and had built his entire professional character around that decision. He trained candidates with a mix of direct critique and long silences that made the critique feel earned when it came. Most recruits found him difficult to read. Ryune found him straightforward. Dunn valued efficiency and was actively skeptical of anything that looked like effort for effort's sake. He gave his endorsement to people who solved problems by the shortest path and withdrew it from people who solved them dramatically. Ryune kept his sessions clean, practical, and short on flourish. Dunn watched him without comment for the first 2 weeks and then moved him to the advanced conditioning track, which was the only acknowledgement he offered and the only one Ryune needed. By the 5th week, he had a passing relationship with most of the other candidates, nothing that would outlast the assessment, but functional enough. One of them had clearly been placed by a rival guild to gather information on Martong's intake methods. Ryune identified this on day 3 and kept the man in easy conversational range, without giving him anything worth reporting. 2 others were genuinely talented and genuinely competitive about it, which made them useful training partners because they pushed harder than the instructors did. He let them win at regular enough intervals that they enjoyed his company. He passed the 8th week evaluation with a score that placed him in the top 3 candidates without placing him first. First would have meant questions he wasn't ready to answer. Second and third meant he was noted and moved forward. The promotion test to 5th grade was assigned 2 weeks after the evaluation results. Each candidate received a different mission package, sealed, with a briefing document inside and a time window for completion. The nature of the missions varied. Some were straightforward extractions, some were surveillance operations, some were the kind of work that was described in guild language as asset termination, which was a cleaner phrase for the same reality. His target was a merchant in Painstroy's commercial district, mid-level, with solid connections in the shipping trade, and a secondary business that the guild had been monitoring for reasons the briefing document described in careful, general language. The target had a bodyguard rotation that changed at irregular intervals. Calculated irregularity, someone on his security team had read the right materials, and a personal pattern that was consistent in one area. He ate dinner at the same establishment every evening, in a private room at the back, with his wife. The wife was the element the briefing document hadn't considered relevant. Ryune observed the target for 4 days from various distances, and none of his angles suggested a clean opportunity that didn't carry significant exposure risk. The bodyguard rotation was genuinely good. The merchant was cautious in his movements. Any direct approach would require dealing with the security layer first, and dealing with the security layer would require time and noise that the mission window didn't accommodate. He spent the 4th night thinking about the wife. She had attended all 4 dinners. She ordered the same wine each time, a specific regional vintage that was carried by only 3 shops in the commercial district, which was a purchasing habit traceable to a vineyard preference, which was personal enough to be useful. She greeted the head server by name. She wore a specific bracelet on her left wrist to all 4 dinners, and touched it occasionally, in a way that wasn't conscious, the small self-soothing gesture of someone who had attached meaning to an object. He went to a chemist shop on the 5th morning and made 3 purchases that individually meant nothing. He went to one of the 3 wine shops in the afternoon, posing as a buyer for a household with specific requirements. He had a conversation with the shop's owner about sourcing and asked which customers currently had standing orders for the vintage he described. The owner, who had the commercial trust instinct of someone who thought about referral business, confirmed that a few household accounts maintained regular orders. He didn't need the specific name. He needed the delivery schedule, which the owner provided as context for when the next shipment would be available. The wine that arrived at the target's home the following day had been briefly, undetectably, and very precisely adjusted. The adjustment affected only one physiological system in a way that produced symptoms indistinguishable from a naturally occurring condition, significant enough to be alarming, specific enough to require immediate medical attention. The symptoms arrived during dinner, in the private room at the back of the restaurant, with the bodyguard rotation positioned outside. The target was home before the evening was out, attending to his wife. His bodyguards were with him, as they should be, having repositioned to the household. The secondary premises the merchant maintained for his other business were unattended by nightfall for the first extended period in several months. Ryune completed the mission objective at the secondary premises and was back across the city before the merchant's medical consultation had concluded. He filed his report 3 days before the window closed. Dunn read it twice. He asked no questions about methodology. He endorsed the promotion. The paperwork that formally established Leon as a 5th grade member of the Martong Guild carried a notation in the evaluating instructors section that said, "Unusual problem approach, efficient outcome, recommend monitoring for advancement." It was the most direct compliment Dunn's written vocabulary apparently extended to. Ryune read it and thought it was fair. He celebrated, if that was the word, by going back to his quarters and conducting 3 hours of internal circuit maintenance and then eating a very ordinary meal alone at a table that had a wobble on the left leg he had been meaning to wedge something under since the first week. The next significant piece of his plan required money, not guild money, his own capital base, independent of the Martong structure, sufficient to begin building the financial layer that House Sermon would need when the political situation in Darren moved into its next phase. He had sources already in motion through Senna's network, but a source he hadn't anticipated was traveling on the road north of Painstroy at that precise time, in a caravan that had more armed escort than its official manifest suggested and slightly less than it needed. He heard about Saint-Anne Rose the way he heard about most things that were useful to him, by paying close attention to what people mentioned when they weren't trying to tell him something. A guild errand took him near the northern way station, and two caravan workers at the way station's communal table were complaining about the route change their employer had insisted on, a longer path, inland rather than coastal, which added 2 days and was inconvenient. One of them mentioned the lady's name and the other mentioned the name of the house pursuing her, and Ryune finished his meal at a pace that didn't suggest he was in any hurry, and left shortly after. House Rose had collapsed. It was recent. The legal action was still in its formal processing stage, which meant the family's assets were technically in dispute, and the personal members were technically protected under the interim provisions, but interim provisions had the useful quality of being ambiguous enough that a house with resources and patience could work around them. House Ani had resources and patience. They had been waiting for the Rose collapse for long enough that their response had been prepared rather than improvised. Sintan Rose was the last legitimate holder of the Rose name. She was traveling with a reduced escort, carrying what remained of the family's movable assets, and attempting to reach a destination that would give her some legal footing before House Ani closed the distance. The knight protecting her was named Kennel. Ryune didn't know him well from the first timeline. He hadn't intersected with this situation in the previous life, House Rose having completed its collapse before Ryune's own circumstances became relevant. But he knew the type, older service, the kind of loyalty that was less a calculation than a disposition, someone who had decided long ago where his service belonged and hadn't reconsidered it regardless of what the odds said. He was riding in the outrider position when Ryune caught up to the caravan, and he identified Ryune's approach as a potential threat inside of about 4 seconds, which was competent. Ryune identified himself as a traveling guild contractor, a categorically accurate description that carried none of its more specific implications, and offered to ride the same road for the next stretch given that they were heading the same direction. Kennel assessed him for a long moment. The assessment criteria were visible in the way his attention moved. Not threat level, because he'd clearly already made a preliminary determination there, but intent. What did this person actually want? Ryune said he'd heard the route through the inland pass was more comfortable this time of year than the coastal alternative. Kennel considered this. He said, "Right at the back." The House Ani pursuers arrived on the second day, in the late afternoon, at the point where the road narrowed between 2 ridges. 3 riders, ahead of the main pursuit group, the scouts, sent to confirm the caravan's position and slow it down if possible. They came over the ridge at a pace that was too deliberate for travelers and positioned across the road with the easy confidence of people who expected this to go a specific way. Kennel moved to the front. His blade was already out. He was doing the arithmetic of 3 against his remaining escort. 4 men, 2 of whom were drivers without combat training, and the arithmetic was not good. Ryune called Kornak. She came out of subspace in the space between the lead rider and the second, which was not where the riders were expecting anything to come from, and the fire she generated was the kind that drew back before it struck. A compression that made a sound like an intake of breath, and then a release that was extremely directional and very specifically targeted at the space the 3 horses occupied, rather than the riders themselves. Horses were tractable creatures in normal conditions, and extremely untractable when fire was directly in front of them. The riders spent the next 30 seconds managing the situation under their saddles instead of the situation on the road. Kornak was still small. She had been growing steadily over the weeks since her creation, accumulating capacity and range and the particular kind of independent will that Ryune had built into her core, but she had the proportions of a young child and the demeanor of someone who found the world profoundly interesting and was not particularly concerned about what it found in return. She settled next to Ryune's stirrup when the riders had retreated around the ridge and looked up at him with those eyes that had been learning and recording every moment since the dungeon. Kennel was staring at her. He looked at Ryune. He looked back at Kornak. Ryune said they should keep moving before the main pursuit group arrived. They made the next way station before dark. Lady Sainton Rose met him properly that evening for the first time. She had been in the enclosed carriage during the incident on the road and had heard the account of it from Kennel's compressed, largely emotion-free version, which she had apparently found slightly insufficient in terms of detail. She was younger than Ryune had expected, maybe 2 years older than him at most, and carried herself with the particular posture of someone who has been taught that composure in difficulty is its own form of statement and has internalized the lesson rather than simply performing it. She asked him directly what he wanted, not as suspicion, as a business premise. She had obviously been thinking about the calculus since Kennel had finished his account. He said he had heard she was looking for stable footing in the current legal situation. He said he had some resources in the form of contacts and operational flexibility, and that he thought there was a structure under which those resources and what remained of the Rose family's assets could produce something more useful than either could separately. He said he wasn't interested in charity arrangements. She looked at him for a moment. She had the focused stillness of someone who processed quickly and didn't show the processing. She asked what structure he had in mind. They talked through most of the evening. Kennel sat at the far end of the table and was there for her security and made no pretense of not listening. Cornac sat in the corner of the room and appeared to be conducting her own form of assessment of the wallpaper pattern, though she was listening to everything. The candles burned down by stages and the night outside got quiet, and the conversation covered more ground than either of them had initially proposed. The structure they arrived at was simple in its fundamentals. She would use what remained of the Rose family's contacts and commercial relationships, which were more intact than her legal situation suggested, because the relationships were personal and the legal status was institutional, and people distinguished between the two, to establish a commercial presence in the territory she was heading toward. He would provide operational support, security coordination through his guild connections, and access to the intelligence network he was building. Revenue split in clearly defined proportions, with a secondary arrangement covering his identity's protection at her end. She asked why she should trust someone she had known for a single evening. He pointed to the window in the direction of the road where the riders had retreated. She considered this briefly. She said that was a valid data point, not a character reference. He said he agreed. He said she should build her own assessment over the first 3 months, and the contract terms included an exit provision that was available to either side without penalty, inside that window, if the assessment went badly. She looked at the provision he'd written. He had drafted the outline during the earlier part of the evening while she was reviewing the formal terms, and marked 2 points for adjustment, which she described precisely and which were reasonable. He adjusted them. They signed the draft copy with the understanding that a formal version would be prepared through proper channels. She kept the signed paper, and he kept his copy, and Kennel produced a very small amount of wine from somewhere and set 2 cups on the table, which was apparently his version of a formal acknowledgement. Cornac looked at the wine cups with the attentive curiosity she brought to most things and made a sound that was somewhere between a question and a comment. Santin Rose looked at Cornac for a long moment. She asked, carefully, what she was. Ryune said it was a long explanation. He said there was time for it on the road tomorrow if she wanted to hear it. She said she would hold him to that. He rode with the caravan for another 2 days, until the road reached a fork that sent them toward different destinations. Kennel and Lady Rose continued north. Ryune turned back toward Painstroy, where the guild's next assignment was already waiting at the desk under Leon's name, and where the next step of what he was building required a different kind of preparation. He had been thinking, on the road, about the Dark Zone. The underground maze south of Fainton's territory was 12 floors deep, each floor its own ecosystem of respawning monsters and structural traps, and one guardian creature at the center whose soul, if extracted correctly, served as an inventory key for the floor below. Most of the guild's dungeon-clearing contracts addressed the upper floors. 7 through 12 were documented, mapped, and cleared on rotation by organized parties of mages and swordmasters working together. Floors 1 through 6 remained largely unknown because what had been sent in hadn't come back with useful information. The 12th floor was the entry point. Its guardian was classified as a significant combat threat, and the soul that the 12th floor's guardian yielded, an orc giant with a specific record in the monster taxonomy that guild members called the Human Slayer, was the key to the 11th floor. Ryune had done the math. He needed the soul for something specific, and he needed to be on the 11th floor for a meeting that couldn't happen anywhere the surface world might observe it. He filed the standard dungeon exploration registration through the guild, and noted he would be entering solo, which produced a brief administrative friction that he resolved by pointing to his 5th grade status and signing the liability provision they required for solo entries. The registration clerk noted his age and clearly thought the liability provision was going to become relevant. He thanked her and collected his entry pass. The 12th floor smelled like standing water and something vegetative and slightly wrong. the particular smell of ecosystems that had developed without sunlight for so long that they had invented their own chemistry. The stone underfoot was smooth where the water ran and loose everywhere else. He moved carefully for the first quarter hour, mapping the layout against what the guild's documentation had described, and found the documentation accurate in its broad points and missing a number of specific details that would have been significant if you were planning to fight your way to the center. He wasn't planning to fight his way to the center. He was planning to walk there, which was a different problem. The goblin population on the 12th floor was dense and organized around a loose hierarchy that meant disturbing one group tended to produce a coordinated response from the surrounding area. He watched this system for 2 days from various concealed positions, learning the patrol timings and the communication signals. On the 3rd day, he began raising the dead ones. There was a steady attrition among the goblin groups. They fought each other for position and resources, which was part of what kept the floor's ecology in balance. The casualties from these internal conflicts went largely unnoticed by the surviving groups, which made them available. He worked at the periphery, pulling one body at a time into his subspace, and over the course of 4 days assembled a working force that no floor-based ecology was expecting to encounter. A zombie horde that moved in the dark, made no sound the living goblins recognized as a threat signal, and followed the behavioral constraints he had built into their activation parameters. He sent them through the inner territory 3 hours before he moved himself. The chaos that followed was useful. He crossed the disrupted patrol network in the window of maximum confusion, reached the central chamber, and found the human slayer waiting in a room that the guild documentation had described as larger than expected. It was. The orc giant was also larger than expected, which was the way these things tended to go. The problem wasn't its size. The problem was that it had a mana reinforcement layer that his ghost-class penetrating techniques were only partially effective against, and the physical dimensions of the central chamber meant there was no way to maintain distance if he needed to reset. He had run the fight in his head before entering and had identified 2 approaches. The first was cleaner, but required a sustained level of mana output that his current circuits made expensive. The second was faster, but depended on creating a specific positioning window that he would have roughly 3 seconds to exploit. He prepared the second approach and went in through the wall. The 3 seconds took most of what he had. He came out of it with 2 broken fingers on his right hand. The cost of the grip required to hold the penetrating strike in position against something with that density of reinforcement, and a significant mana deficit that left the room slightly unsteady at the edges. The orc giant was on the floor. He stood over it and conducted the soul extraction with his left hand, and watched the system confirm the acquisition, and sat down on the nearest stable piece of stone, and let his breathing return to something normal. He looked at the broken fingers. He set them himself, which was the kind of pain that argued with your focus, regardless of how practiced you were at managing it. He wrapped them with cloth from his pack, and activated the basic regeneration skill that his necromancer tree had made available, which worked slowly, and was less elegant than a healer, but had the advantage of requiring no explanation to anyone. He rested 4 hours. Then he moved toward the stairs down to the 11th floor, and went to find his mother. The 11th floor was different from the 12th in ways that went beyond the obvious. The air was drier. The stone was darker, cut from a different layer of the earth beneath Fainton's territory, and the ceiling rose high enough that the torches Ryune carried threw more shadow than light. The creature ecology here was heavier. Larger monsters, slower cycles, the kind of floor that took organized parties weeks to clear and respawned its population over months rather than days. He had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when he heard voices. Sena's first. She was giving an instruction to someone about a perimeter marker, her tone carrying the clipped efficiency of a person managing multiple simultaneous concerns. Then a deeper voice that Ryune recognized by its register before he was close enough to make out words. Alejandro, saying something that ended in a short laugh, the first genuine one Ryune had heard from him since the carriage. And then, quieter, a woman's voice that did something to his chest that he couldn't have described precisely and didn't try to. He stepped into the torchlight of their camp. The reaction was immediate and not orderly. Sena made a sound that she would later decline to characterize. Alejandro was on his feet before the sound had finished, one hand at his sword before he registered the face, and then the hand came away from the sword and he stood there with the expression of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. Celine Serene was the last one to move. She was standing at the edge of the camp's torchlight when he arrived, and she stayed where she was for a moment after the others had reacted, looking at him with an attention so complete it had no social performance in it. She was in field armor, practical, worn at the elbows and knees from real use, not the formal presentation pieces that had hung in her study. Her hair was pulled back, and she had a cut on her left cheekbone that was healing badly from insufficient rest. She looked like someone who had been fighting a war that nobody above ground was officially acknowledging, which was an accurate description of her situation. She crossed the distance between them and stopped within arm's reach. He had expected to feel the old resentment. He had carried it for so long in his first life, not loudly, not in a way he had articulated, but as a persistent background weight, the specific ache of a child who felt abandoned by the person who was supposed to be the final barrier against everything going wrong. He had blamed her in ways he hadn't named, for things that hadn't entirely been hers to prevent. Standing here now, looking at that cut on her cheekbone and the specific wear pattern on her armor, and the way she was holding herself with composure, that was costing her something real, the resentment was simply absent, not suppressed, gone. The way things go when the understanding that replaces them is large enough to take the whole space. She told him he looked terrible for someone who was supposedly in bed with nerve irritation. He said the nerve irritation had mostly resolved. She put her hand on his face. Just briefly, the way you check that something is really there. Then she removed it and looked at him steadily and said, "Tell me everything." He didn't tell her everything. He told her the version that could be verified, omitting the elements that would require explanations he wasn't ready to give. The century in Aden, the full scope of what he'd built in 3 months of ostensible recovery, the current contents of his subspace. He told her that he had information the family needed, that he had obtained it through methods she probably wouldn't endorse and he was not going to apologize for, and that there was something he needed her to consider that would feel counterintuitive. They sat at the camp's central fire. Alejandro sat to Ryune's left and spent most of the conversation looking at him the way you look at something you thought you'd lost and are taking inventory of now that it's back. Sena had her notebook open and was writing in it, which was her way of managing situations that moved faster than her frameworks could easily accommodate. Colin had apparently joined the expedition 3 weeks ago, which Ryune had not known, and was making tea with the focused attention she brought to everything domestic that she could control when the larger situation felt ungovernable. Ryune talked about the house sermon situation from the angle of someone who had assembled intelligence from multiple sources. He described the political positioning of the houses arrayed against them, accurate, based on what Sands had provided and what his own network had added since. He described the legal architecture of how the attack would proceed. He described the specific vulnerability that great family status created. Here was the counterintuitive part. House Sermon's great family designation placed them formally outside any kingdom's legal jurisdiction. That independence had historically been protective. Currently, it was the mechanism the hostile houses intended to use. An independent entity could be moved against without any kingdom being obligated to respond. There was no treaty violation in attacking a great family because no treaty covered great families. The attacking houses could conduct the campaign under legal ambiguity indefinitely, bleeding House Sermon's resources until the family had no standing left to protect. The solution was to relinquish the designation voluntarily. Celine's expression during this part of his presentation was the expression of a very experienced military mind encountering an argument that is technically sound and instinctively offensive. She said that what he was describing was surrender. He said it was the opposite. A family under a kingdom's legal protection was a family that every hostile house would have to approach through official channels. Attacking them became politically costly in ways that attacking an independent entity was not. The great family status was the weapon being used against them. Removing it also removed the weapon. She was quiet for a while. Alejandro said nothing, which was his mode when he was genuinely thinking, rather than performing consideration. Sena had stopped writing. Ryune said he had dreamed this. He let the statement sit for a moment before continuing. A specific, detailed account of a vision he had experienced during his recovery. A sequence of images that had shown him the legal attack coming, and its endpoint, and this solution. He described it with the precision of someone describing a real event, because the facts he was describing were real, and the framing was the only fiction. Whether Celine believed the dream as a mechanism was unclear. She was a practical person and did not have strong mystical inclinations. But she had been waiting for something, some ground under her feet that held, and what he was giving her was not comfort but strategy, which was the thing she actually needed and could use. She told Alejandro to get the relevant documentation from the outer case. The preparation took several days. They needed a formal record and witnesses and the right filing channels for the Kingdom of Darren's administrative system, all of which Sina had been keeping track of for exactly this kind of contingency. Ryune spent the time with his family in the way he had not spent time with them in a previous life, present, paying attention, not inside the withdrawal that trauma had built around him. He ate meals with them at the camp table. He answered questions when they asked them, and let silences be silences when they arrived naturally. He learned things he hadn't known. His mother had been making supply runs to the 9th floor with Alejandro twice a month, the area where the signal they'd received from the missing heirs had originated, before it had gone quiet. She had not stopped going. She would not stop until she knew. She described this with the flat determination of someone who has made a decision so complete that discussing it serves only informational purposes, and he sat with that information and did not say the things that came up in him, because they were not things he could make useful. He watched her train one morning from the far edge of the camp. She practiced before the others were awake, while the light from the deep floor bioluminescence was still the only light in the camp. Swordmaster technique at full expression was a different thing from what lesser ranks produced. Not faster or stronger in ways that were simply quantitative, but integrated in a way that made the whole system of the body feel like one mechanism rather than a collection of parts doing related things. She moved through the forms for 30 minutes, and Ryune watched every second of it and thought about the form he'd been rebuilding in himself, and how far it still had to go. She saw him watching when she finished. She lowered the blade and held it down at her side, and looked back at him across the camp. She told him she wanted to test him before he left. He said he understood. She said she was going to use full power. She wanted to know what he was capable of, and she could not accurately assess that against anything less. She said this with the direct severity of a military officer establishing rules of engagement, not with the emotional weight that the content of the statement probably deserved. Your mother is about to strike you at killing force to find out if you're worth believing in. The sentence didn't have a comfortable shape. He said he was ready. She gave him 5 seconds and then she moved. A swordmaster's full strike had no wind-up that was visible to someone not trained specifically to read it. The tell was in the feet, a specific weight shift that happened before the upper body showed anything, and Ryune had been watching her footwork for 3 days and knew the signature. He was already in the process of activating etherealization when the blade's arc reached the point where it became unavoidable. Phase shifting at the physical level meant his body's relationship to solid matter became temporarily ambiguous. The blade passed through him, not around him, not past him, through the space his body occupied. He felt it the way you feel the memory of pain, rather than pain itself. An impression of force, without the structural consequence that force should have produced. He emerged from the etherealization on the other side of the arc, with his clothing cut across the left shoulder and a long, shallow wound across his collarbone, where the phase transition had caught slightly at the entry point. His timing on the drop into the skill wasn't perfect, which was the cost of still being weeks away from a fully clean technique. Blood ran down his chest. He held his ground and kept his posture level, and met her eyes. She had completed the follow-through, and was standing in the landing position, blade down, looking at him with an expression that was the most unguarded thing he had seen from her in either lifetime. Alejandro said something very quietly from across the camp. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. Celine straightened. She told Ryune needed to be closed before he left the floor. Her voice was controlled and her eyes were not. She sheathed the blade in a motion that was composed and practiced and said nothing after that, which was a kind of acknowledgement that had more weight than any formal declaration she could have offered. He thanked her. He meant it for more things than the test. Colin closed the wound with the healing kit she'd carried in the floor pack for exactly this category of situation. The category of situation that arose around Ryune specifically, she noted, in the tone of someone who has accepted a professional reality even if they reserve the right to comment on it. She worked efficiently and was finished in 20 minutes and handed him a clean shirt without ceremony. He left the 11th floor 2 days later with the relinquishment documentation filed, and a formally acknowledged status change that would take 3 weeks to process through Darren's administration. On the surface, House Sermon had voluntarily surrendered its independence. In every direction that mattered, they had just made themselves substantially harder to attack. Sena walked him to the floor transit stairs. She said nothing for most of the walk, which meant she was composing something. At the stairs, she told him that she had known, in the past timeline, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. She did not know the specifics of what Ryune had survived. She said she didn't need to. She said she was going to assume it was bad enough to justify everything he was doing now, and that she intended to make sure it didn't happen again. She went back to camp before he could answer her. He climbed the stairs and came up through the dungeon's surface entrance into afternoon light and stood outside for a moment before moving toward the road. The assignment he had been avoiding thinking about was waiting. His 4th grade promotion mission at the Martong Guild required travel east to a territory called Khalid, where reports of unusual dungeon activity had been classified in the guild's internal system as requiring a 4th grade operative's assessment. He'd requested the assignment deliberately. He had reasons for wanting to be in Khaled that the guild didn't know about. He had also apparently been given a partner. This information was in the assignment documentation he'd collected from the guild desk before departing for the Dark Zone. The partner assignment was listed as a late addition to the file, which meant it had been approved after his registration and was someone else's initiative. The name on the file was Asan, no given name, just the family name, with the title listed as Guild Assistant, unranked. The assignment notes describe the individual as accompanying support, local familiarity designation, advise accordingly. Ryune read this 3 times and then set the document down and looked at the wall of his quarters for a moment. He knew that name. The Asan family maintained one of the oldest assassin bloodlines in the region. They were guild adjacent but not guild members. Their family operated independently, under their own structure, and the Martong Guild maintained a careful diplomatic relationship with them that involved mutual restraint and the occasional cooperative arrangement. The family's senior members were formidable in ways that the public-facing guild system didn't have good categories for. They were also, in the timeline Ryune had lived previously, largely destroyed by a conflict with a noble house that hadn't happened yet. The daughter's name had been Lavina. She'd kept herself hidden. The existence of a surviving heir to the Asan line was information her enemies would have used, so she had constructed an identity at the edges of the guild's organizational structure and made herself look harmless and slightly strange while monitoring the situation that threatened her family. Ryune had encountered her late in his first life, briefly, and the impression he had retained was of someone whose eccentricity was almost entirely performance and whose actual assessment capacity was extremely sharp. The assignment documentation described her as having local familiarity with Khalid. This was plausible as a cover. What it didn't describe was why the Asan family's surviving heir would insert herself into a 4th grade mission under a false professional designation. He would find out when they arrived. The road to Khaled took 4 days. Lavina met him at the east gate of Fainton on departure morning, wearing a traveling robe that was slightly too large, and carrying a bag that jangled when she walked with a collection of items whose purpose wasn't immediately apparent. She introduced herself as a guild assistant with local knowledge of the Khalid dungeon system, and offered her hand with the confident, slightly chaotic energy of someone who had decided in advance that their impression on this first meeting was going to be eccentric and was committing to it fully. Ryune shook her hand and said he was looking forward to working together. She looked at him briefly with an expression that shifted too fast to read before the chaotic energy came back. She said the journey was going to be interesting. They traveled mostly in companionable silence, with periodic conversations that she initiated and he participated in at the level he judged appropriate. She asked questions about his background, his training history, his approach to dungeon clearances, with the casual curiosity of someone assembling information for purposes they hadn't named. He answered each question with something that was factually accurate and professionally appropriate, and which added to her picture without advancing it past what he wanted her to have. She was doing the same thing, he noted. Every answer she gave was shapeable. She was genuinely interesting to talk to, which made the assessment work she was doing easy to lose track of if you weren't paying attention. He paid attention. The village of Khalid was at the base of a rock formation that the regional maps marked as the Khalid Escarpment, a natural structural feature that had been partially cleared and tunneled over several decades to create an extensive dungeon system. The dungeon itself served the territory as both an economic resource, cleared monster materials were valuable, and a persistent security problem since incompletely cleared floors tended to produce overflow incidents into the surrounding settlement. The guild's assignment documentation indicated that the recent activity had moved from ordinary overflow into something categorically different. The first indication of what different meant arrived at the village gate in the form of 3 men who had apparently been assigned to watch for the guild's arrival and who greeted them with the relief of people who have been managing a bad situation by themselves and have just been told help was coming. The watch commander told them, in a compressed and slightly fragmented account that suggested he had given it multiple times to different people and was not sleeping enough, that 7 men from the outer settlement had gone missing in the past 3 months. All male, all adult, all vanishing from the same general radius around the dungeon's lower access points. Lavina asked how many bodies had been found. The watch commander said none. She looked at Ryune. He said they should review the dungeon access logs before going underground. The dungeon itself showed signs of modification on the 3rd level down. Structural changes to the original tunnel network, passages that weren't on any official map, the kind of construction work that required either a large labor force or magic capable of moving stone in volume. There was also a smell that Ryune identified on the 2nd day of their survey and said nothing about immediately because it was recognizable from specific Adon encounters and required some thought about the best way to handle what it implied. Lavina identified it on the 3rd day. She said, without making it a question, that the smell was biological modification work, the specific kind produced by sustained alchemical transformation of a living subject. Ryune asked if she had encountered it before. She looked at him. She said her family had a history with that category of work and left it there. They found the first Ratman on the 4th day, through a sealed door on the modified 3rd level. A human-sized figure with physical characteristics that belonged to neither category its name implied fully. Something in between, the result of a sustained transformation process that had gone in one direction without any provision for going back. It was in a cage. It looked at them with eyes that still held something human behind the physical alteration, and it reached through the cage bars with hands that were partway through becoming something else. Lavina's expression, looking at it, was very still. Ryune found the records room on the same day, in a side passage that a casual survey would have missed. The mage behind this operation, the name in the records was listed as GMA, a designation rather than a name, suggesting a title or an organizational code, had kept documentation with the thoroughness of a researcher who believed the work justified the methodology. The records detailed the transformation process, the subject's origin, and an external benefactor whose involvement appeared in the financial ledgers as a series of payments that bore the administrative seal of the Khaled Knight Commander's office. He read the relevant sections. He showed Lavina the ledger page with the commander's seal. She studied it for a moment and said, "So we have 2 of them." He said it appeared that way. She asked if the guild assignment covered the commander. He said it covered the dungeon irregularity and its source. The interpretation of that coverage was the kind of thing that could reasonably extend to include whoever was funding the irregularity. She looked at him with that too-fast expression again. She said she was beginning to think the guild had underclassified this assignment. He agreed with her and kept moving toward the records room's secondary section, where the most recent material was filed, and began reading about how many subjects were currently in active transformation and what the intended deployment of the resulting force was supposed to look like. The records told a story that didn't require much interpretation. GMA had been running a systematic abduction program for 8 months, working from a list organized by physical parameters: male, adult, within a specific age range, selected from outer settlements where disappearances would generate official attention slowly. The transformation process took 3 to 5 weeks per subject. Current subjects in various stages of the process: 14. Completed subjects in active deployment status: 22. The intended purpose was documented in one section with the neutral language of someone who had entirely decoupled their professional assessment from the people involved. A specialized military force, loyal to the commander through binding mechanisms built into the transformation, deployable without official record. Caden Caleb's arrangement with GMA had the structure of a long-term investment. He had been providing funding and dungeon access for months before the first abduction, which meant the plan had existed in preparation long before it moved into execution. The commander of Khalid's knights, the man whose official function was the settlement's protection, had been building a private army from his own people. Lavina set the ledger down. She said, "Where are they?" The active subjects were held in a purpose-built wing, accessible through a door that looked structural. Ryune had noted it on the second day and had been waiting until they had enough context to approach it correctly. He said, "2 levels deeper. East passage, sealed door." She asked if he had a plan. He said he had a general direction and several contingencies. She said that sounded like the honest version of a plan and followed him into the passage. Commander Caden found them before they found the sealed door. He came from the upper level with 6 knights in full armor. Proper military equipment, not the improvised materials of a small settlement's guard force. He had clearly known they were inside and had decided the most efficient response was to deal with it personally rather than wait for it to develop. He was a large man, perhaps 50, with the physical certainty of someone who had served in real campaigns and retained the conditioning from them. He looked at Ryune and Lavina with the flat assessment of a professional evaluating a tactical situation and told them they had made an unfortunate discovery. He said he bore them no personal hostility, but that the project they had stumbled into was at a stage where exposure couldn't be accommodated. He said the guild would receive a report indicating their operatives had been lost in a dungeon collapse. Lavina said, "That sounds inconvenient for us." Caden nodded at the knights. Ryune had been preparing since the upper landing. The Curse of Arkan pushed back against high-volume mana output with increasing severity. The harder he drove his circuits, the more the expulsion mechanism fought the compression, and the longer he sustained it, the worse the accumulated penalty became. He had run this particular calculation before leaving the records room. The penalty was going to be significant. He was going to do it anyway. He opened the compression fully and pushed everything he had through the sealed door side passage and into the wing beyond. The door buckled. The wall beside it cracked from floor to ceiling in under 2 seconds. The sounds from behind it changed. Movement, metal on stone, something large shifting in a space that hadn't been opened in weeks. The curse penalty hit him at roughly the same moment. Pressure behind his eyes and a loosening in his hands that meant fine motor control was temporarily compromised. He braced against the passage wall and kept his feet. The door came down. 22 rat men came out of it. They had been completed subjects. The transformation finished. The original person largely inaccessible behind the new physical structure. But Ryune's working had done something specific to the binding mechanism GMA had built into each of them. Inverted the loyalty construct without breaking the structure underneath, leaving the compliance mechanism intact and redirecting its output. The rat men emerging from that wing were not free. They were bound to a different instruction set entirely. He gave them one. Caden had half a second to register what was happening before they were moving, and half a second was not enough time to retreat cleanly, with 6 knights in a passage of that width. He tried anyway. The knights held their formation with professional discipline that was genuinely impressive and entirely insufficient. Ryune watched from the passage wall with his back against the stone, managing the curse penalty's effect on his balance, and tracking the situation with the detached attention of someone who had designed the outcome and was now observing its execution. He stacked the curse layers on Caden specifically, 4 in sequence, each one building on the last, a technique theorized against armored targets in add-on and never properly tested until this moment. The stacks were additive rather than cumulative. The 4th layer didn't simply continue the 3rd but compounded against it. The commander's armor enchantment tried to engage its suppression and found itself working against a mechanism that treated the armor as part of the target's physical system rather than an external factor. Caden went to his knees. He said something toward Ryune, a sentence that didn't finish itself. His expression shifted from command posture into something rawer, and then he stopped talking, and the passage became loud with other things. Ryune turned away. GMA was deeper in the wing, in a sealed interior room equipped with instruments that had no business existing beneath a civilian settlement. He was not what the record's tone had suggested. The records had been written with the cool precision of an institutional researcher. The man in the laboratory was older, smaller, and working with the focused intensity of someone who had spent so long inside his project that the world outside it had lost dimensionality. He looked at Ryune with genuine annoyance rather than fear, the annoyance of an expert interrupted mid-procedure. He told Ryune the subjects were at a critical stage and that disruption would compromise months of work. He said this with the earnest frustration of someone who expected the information to matter to his audience. Lavina asked where the remaining subjects were. The ones still in process. GMA said they were contained and stable and required his specific monitoring to remain so. She told him to step away from the equipment. He looked at her, then at Ryune, and something in the architecture of the situation finally reached him. The absence of Kaiden's knights from the passage, the sounds from the subject wing, the specific quality of silence where he would have expected his own security to respond. His expression went through several stages and ended somewhere quieter and far less certain. The Ratman came through the laboratory wall from the side, larger than the completed subjects Ryune had encountered, a specialized variant, further along in the transformation than any of the others. It moved with the deliberate quality of something operating on a single instruction that had displaced everything else. It looked at GMA. Ryune understood what he was seeing. He had read the earliest intake documentation. The first subject had been acquired from the settlement's outer edge, a young man, adult, physically appropriate for the process. The intake record listed the name as Sarman, initial J. Old Lady Sarman had come to the guild office the week before Ryune's departure, with an heirloom ring and savings accumulated over years of careful household management, asking if anyone could find her sons. She had apologized for the smallness of what she was offering. She had held the ring out with both hands. The rat man in the doorway had eyes that were mostly changed, but something in them, looking at the mage who had taken everything from him, was the original person looking through whatever the process had left accessible. GMA said a name, an activation phrase for the control binding. It didn't work. The inverted loyalty construct had reached this subject through the wing's connected system when Ryune had opened the door. The Ratman said something, broken, brief, not addressed to GMA. The syllables had been words once, carrying the shape of gratitude even after the apparatus of pronunciation had been rebuilt into something that struggled with human speech. Lavina made a sound. One, quickly controlled. The detonation was internal. A failsafe GMA had built into his advanced subjects, which the Ratman had activated deliberately rather than being triggered into. Ryune pulled Lavina behind the passage corner in the half-second between the activation sound and the release, and the wall between them and the laboratory absorbed most of the structural consequence. When the stone settled, the laboratory was open to the floor above, and neither GMA nor the Ratman remained as concerns. The ring was near the laboratory's threshold, separated from the rubble by the specific luck of its position. Small, plain, the kind of object that wouldn't attract attention from anyone not looking for it. The appraisal signature his system registered from it was not small at all. He picked it up and let the identification work run, and read what came back, and stood with that information for a moment before moving. It was a map encoded in the ring's structure, a spatial record of a sealed tomb, accessible only to someone carrying the ring alongside a specific soul construct. He felt the connection between the ring and the orc giant's soul in his inventory activate, quiet and certain, like a latch finding its groove. Lavina had been watching him. She asked what the ring was. He said it was something he needed to follow up on. He said they should document the remaining subjects before leaving the dungeon. The 14 people still in active transformation were recoverable at their current stages, given proper intervention. He documented each one's condition in the guild's required format and arranged for an extraction protocol through Sena's network, issued under a medical contractor's seal. He could not reverse what had already happened to the completed subjects. He could ensure the process stopped here and the people still inside it received whatever could still be given. He filed the mission report with the village watch commander, a compressed account naming Kaiden, documenting the abduction network's scope, and recommending immediate review of the Knight Commander's office. He left evidence in places the review would find. He did not mention GMA by name, because the laboratory's current state had made that documentation largely academic. Old Lady Sarman was at the apothecary near the settlement's main gate when they emerged. She was purchasing something for sleep, the kind of small practical measure people resort to when dread has been occupying the body long enough that rest stops arriving on its own. She was small and considerably older than her sons, and she carried her bag with the careful efficiency of someone who had been managing a household alone for a long time. He crossed the street to her. He returned the ring and told her it should come back to her family. He told her about Joran, not the specifics of what the transformation had done to him, but the essential truth, that her son had known who he was at the end. that the choice he had made in that laboratory had been an act of will, and not a loss of it. He said what Joran had done had mattered. She held the ring and was quiet for a while. When she spoke, it was not about the ring. She thanked him for coming to Khalid at all, and her voice was steady in a way that her eyes were not, and he stood with her until the quiet between them felt complete rather than unfinished. The village held a brief commendation ceremony the next morning. He accepted it, thanked the settlement, and was ready to leave by midday. Lavina caught him at the road. She was no longer carrying the jangling bag. She had left it at the inn, a small departure from the eccentric assistant character she'd maintained throughout the mission. Her tone had shifted entirely from the performance layer. She said she had a specific ability, a family technique passed through bloodlines of a particular kind. She said she wanted to test him with it. She said if he refused she would understand, but that she had reasons for needing to know what kind of person he actually was. He said, "Go ahead." The divine bolt hit from 3 paces, faster than the wind-up had indicated. Not a combat technique in the conventional sense, more accurately, a purity assessment, a working that measured the soul's fundamental composition the way a tuning fork measures frequency. It should have produced a reading of his current spiritual state. Whatever that state was after over a century in Aden, the bolt found it and came right back. The rebound was immediate and clean. Lavina's expression came apart for approximately 2 seconds before professional composure reassembled itself. She was looking at him with something past surprise. He said, "House Hassan. 4th generation. Your mother's ability manifested as a diagnostic, your father's as a combat application. You carry both. The Martong Guild believes you're support personnel." A pause. She asked who he was. He said he had studied under Vad. He watched what that name did to her face and continued. He said Vad had spoken of her family with specific regard. He said that during his training he had encountered something unexpected. A communication, the kind Vad's tradition permitted between the living and those who had passed on. He said her mother had wanted things said. He was careful about what came next. He used what he knew from his first life encounter with Lavina, the brief account she had given him then of what she missed and what had been left unfinished, and built something from those materials that was true in its emotional architecture, even if its mechanism was fabricated. A small habit of her mother's, a phrase she had used, a piece of guidance about the family's hidden archive that he had no reasonable way to know from any normal source. He had known it because Lavina had told him once, years forward in a timeline this version of her hadn't lived. He turned that into something that sounded like it came from a different direction entirely. She was crying by the time he finished. The real kind, not the performative kind. The sort that catches in the throat and has no shape to it. She was also, he noted, extremely angry, which was characteristic of grief that had been sitting with nowhere to go. She asked how she was supposed to verify any of it. He said she probably couldn't. He said she could decide what to do with it regardless. She was quiet for a long time. The road stretched flat ahead of them, and the afternoon light ran long across it, and somewhere down ahead a bird was doing something repetitive in a tree they hadn't reached yet. She said, "What do you need from me?" He told her. The tomb entrance was 2 hours east of Khaled, inside a stone formation that looked, from the road, like a natural feature. The ring resonated at close range, warm and specific, a door recognizing something it had been waiting for. The stone moved. Ryune went in alone. The orc giant's soul served as the inner seal's activation key. He placed it at the mechanism's center, and the seal opened, and the tomb's interior revealed itself. A chamber sealed long enough that the air had developed its own quality, old and still, and carrying the faint metallic trace of preserved magic. The heroes' souls came out of the walls, not metaphorically. The chamber's structural material had been used as a storage medium. Dozens of souls compressed into the stone itself, accumulated across decades or centuries, released the moment the seal opened. They hit Ryune in a wave that carried no physical violence but an interior impact unlike anything he had experienced before. Each soul brought its entire accumulated existence, lifetimes of combat knowledge, pain memory, skill architecture, the full weight of a person compressed into its essential form, and they were all, simultaneously, trying to occupy the space his own soul held. His body was not built for this. Nothing human was. He went to his knees and stayed there. The curse's expulsion mechanism engaged against the soul weight the same way it engaged against mana, automatically, reflexively, and the conflict between expulsion and inflow created interior pressure that built fast toward a threshold his system was identifying in terms he didn't want to examine directly. He forced his focus past the pain and into the circuit layer. Not fighting the influx, not fighting the expulsion, finding the adjustment that could accommodate both at once. He altered his body's base circuit structure in real time, which was the kind of statement that sounded manageable and felt, from inside, like performing surgery on yourself with no instruments and no anesthetic, using only theoretical knowledge of where everything should be. He found the first junction and widened it, found the secondary channel and cleared what the expulsion had built there, found the soul storage capacity and expanded it by brute force stat allocation, pulling points from the system's pool while his hands shook against the floor. The hero's souls settled, not all of them. His capacity wasn't infinite, and the process had cost him enough that determining precisely what he'd retained versus what had dissipated would require a calmer moment. What remained was substantial. What remained included Harmon. The Orc chieftain's soul was identifiable by its weight and character. A different kind of presence from the others, specific and purposeful. A warrior's lifetime organized around values legible enough that a tomb had been built to protect what he'd left behind. The gauntlet sat on a stone plinth at the chamber's center, plain, heavy, sized for a much larger hand than Ryune's, but carrying a magical signature that his identification skill had to run twice before returning a complete result. He put it in subspace and sat in the chamber for a while before he trusted his legs. He reached the road before dark. Lavina was where he'd left her, sitting on a rock at the road's edge without pretending to do anything. She looked at him when he emerged, and whatever she saw in his face made her stand. He told her he was fine. She looked unconvinced. He said they should move before the light went completely. They walked back to Khalid. She didn't ask what was in the tomb. Outside his door that night he found a bowl of something hot she had arranged without mentioning, and he sat on the floor with his back against the bed frame and ate it, and found it considerably better than expected. The road back to Fainton took 4 days. They talked about the route, the weather shifting toward the colder season, the guild's internal inefficiencies, which she had opinions on that were specific and accurate, and delivered with the satisfaction of someone who had been observing an institution critically long enough to develop genuine expertise. By the second day, the performance layer was gone entirely, and the person underneath it was sharper and more interesting, and considerably less chaotic than the version she'd been presenting. He thought she was going to be a very effective ally. Fainton's guild branch greeted his return with the same professional neutrality it applied to everything. The reception desk directed him to the upper office. The anteroom held a senior assassin named Sman, built substantially, with the slightly worn quality of someone who had spent considerable time ensuring other people noticed he was built substantially. He told Ryune to wait. He said it in the tone of someone who had found that tone worked on most people. Ryune said he had a mission report to file and a promotion review to request. Sman said he could file the report when the manager was available, and after a pause stepped closer than professional courtesy required and offered a comment about entry-grade candidates and proper protocol. Ryune came out of the chair in one motion, took Sman's extended arm at the wrist and elbow, and seated him on the floor with the arm locked at an angle that made continued standing difficult and aggression inadvisable. He held the position until Sman stopped testing it, then released it and stepped back and straightened his collar. The inner door opened. Branch Manager Sapphire stood in the frame looking at Sman on the floor and at Ryune standing with his collar straight, and her expression arranged itself into something that contained a significant amount of information she wasn't prepared to share yet. She told Sman to take the morning. She told Ryune to come in. He presented the Khalid mission report in full. Documentation, the abduction network scope, the link to Caden's administrative seal, and the outcome for each element of the assignment. She read through it without interrupting. He watched her read and noted where she paused and what the pauses said about what she was revising in her prior picture of the situation. She set the report down and said the assignment had been classified at the 4th grade level because its documentation had suggested a 4th grade operational complexity. She said what he had just presented documented something she didn't have a clean category for. He said, "That's my point." She looked at him. She asked what he wanted. He said he wanted the 4th grade promotion formalized and access to classified guild information as the mission's supplementary reward. Not operational files, he named the specific category. Historical records on certain noble families and their covert connections to events across Darren and Painstroy over the past decade. The kind of information the Guild collected as a matter of course and filed in sections that didn't appear on the standard access registry. She said that category was restricted to 3rd grade and above. He said he had just submitted a mission exceeding 4th grade parameters and that the grade 3 threshold was a formality they could address separately. He said he would prefer to address it now. Sapphire opened the upper drawer of her desk. She produced the formal grade advancement documentation. She pulled out a second form, the classified access request, with a section at the bottom that required her signature alone. She set both on the desk, picked up a stylus, and signed them. She asked what specifically he was looking for. Ryune leaned forward slightly across the desk and told her.